Hey guys, tonight we are leaving the modern world behind to trek across the shimmering, gleeful expanse of the 14th century Sahara. You might think you are a seasoned traveler because you can navigate a subway map. But let me tell you, if you stepped into the deep desert back then with nothing but a smile, you preserved piece of sun, dried jerky before the first sunset, is a place where the horizon is a liar, and your best friend is a creature that smells like wet wool and wants to spit in your eye. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you are ready to drift off, drop a comment with your city and the current time so I know who's out there in the dark with me. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes and find yourself standing on the edge of Timbuktu. But you aren't here for the gold. At least, not yet. You are a junior member of a Tagaza, a massive salt caravan preparing to head north. Your feet are clad in simple goatskin sandals, and the sand is already beginning to seep between your toes, warm and restless, and the sharp, metallic tang of the massive rock, salt slabs being strapped to the backs of thousands of camels. You wearing a long indigo, dyed robe that leaves faint blue stains on your skin, a mark of the desert nomads who know that dark colors actually help protect you from the sun. A mainstream historical point you need to understand is that in the Mali Empire, salt was the ultimate power move. While Europe was obsessed with spices, West Africa was desperate for sodium. In the humid southern regions, you could literally trade a pound of salt for a pound of gold. This wasn't just greed, it was biological survival. Without salt, the human body fails in the heat, and food rots in the humidity. A biological machine of commerce that kept one of the wealthiest empires in history from collapsing. But here, it's a quirky and slightly terrifying detail. The camels you looking at aren't just pack animals. They are the 14th century version of high-tech hardware. Did you know a camel can lose up to 30% of its body weight in water and still keep walking? If a human lost just 10%, we'd be seeing hallucinations of an air-conditioned Starbucks. You watch your camel, a particularly grumpy beast you have named Salty, as he lets out a groan that sounds like a rusty gate. He looks at you with a gaze of pure, unadulterated judgment. He knows he has the only reason you're going to make it to the next well, and he's going to make sure you know it, too. Interestingly, there's a bit of a scholarly debate regarding the silent trade of the Sahara. For centuries, Arab chroniclers claimed that traders would leave their salt on a riverbank, beat a drum, and retreat. The local gold miners would then leave piles of gold and disappear. The two sides never saw each other. Academic circles are still debating whether this was a real, standardized practice to avoid language barriers and conflict, or if it was a bit of a legendary exaggeration intended to make the West African gold lands seem more mysterious and uncivilized to outsiders. You wonder if you'll ever actually see the person who ends up eating. The sun begins to dip, and the Kabir, the master navigator. The sound of 1,000 camels rising at once is like a slow motion landslide. You grab Salty, his lead rope, feeling the coarse hair and the immense strength of the animal. You aren't walking on a road. You are walking on a Taten, an invisible path known only to the experts who can read the texture of the dunes like a book. To your left, a merchant is checking his water skins, made from turned inside out goat hides. They look like bloated, headless animals hanging from the saddles. but they are the only things standing between you and a very dusty death. As you take your first few steps into the open desert, the heat of the day begins to radiate upward from the ground. It feels like walking on a giant, cooling radiator. Brick walls of Timbuktu one last time. From here on out, there are no landmarks. There are no trees. There is only the repetitive, hypnotic swish, swish of sandals in sand and the rhythmic creaking of leather straps. You feel a strange sense of smallness. In the Sahara, you aren't a person, and the first stars begin to punch through the twilight. You realize that your entire life now depends on those tiny pinpricks of light. You aren't just a traveler. You are a navigator in a golden ocean. You adjust your headcloth, pulling it tight against the rising wind, and settle into the march. And your first step just landed in a pile of camel dung. Welcome to the Sahara. The night has fully claimed the desert now, and the temperature has plummeted so fast it feels like someone tossed you into a cellar. Your indigo robe, which felt like a sauna just 3 hours ago, is now your only defense against a wind that feels like it is made of liquid ice. You re-walking, your eyes locked on the rhythmic swaying of salty tail. Every time the line slows down, salty's heavy, salt-laden side bumps into your shoulder. A gentle reminder that if you stop walking, he's perfectly happy to trample you into the sand. The silence is absolute, broken only by the creak, thud of the salt slabs, and the occasional lonely whistle of a handler trying to keep the lead camels from drifting. You are part of a massive, moving city. A typical caravan could involve anywhere from 1,000 to 12,000 camels. To put that in perspective, that's a line of animals that could stretch for over 10 miles. This wasn't just a group of guys with backpacks. They had to calculate exactly how much water and fodder was needed for thousands of biological machines while navigating a landscape that had 0 refill stations. The Mali Empire didn't just stumble into wealth. They engineered a supply chain across a wasteland that would make modern logistics experts have a nervous breakdown. But here, a sightly gross detail that your history books usually skip. The water. If things got truly desperate and a well was dry, ancient accounts suggest that some traders would actually listen to the ground using a hollowed-out camel bone. By placing it against the sand, they could supposedly hear the faint, deep underground movement of water, or the scurrying of beetles. It's essentially the 14th century version of a dowsing rod, but with more camel anatomy involved. You look at the ground and realize you can hear anything but your own heartbeat and salty, heavy breathing. Interestingly, there is a bit of a scholarly debate regarding the great disappearance of certain Saharan routes. For years, historians have tried to map the exact paths taken by the 14th century salt caravans, but academic circles are still debating whether the Sahara was actually greener, or at least more navigable, back then than it is now. Some researchers argue that the desert has expanded significantly, a process called desertification, meaning the wells you are looking for might have been much closer together 700 years ago. Others claim the traders were just that much tougher. You hope for the former, because looking at the endless dunes ahead, The idea of toughness feels very insufficient compared to the idea of a vanished well. You look up, and the Milky Way is so bright, glowing river of spilled salt across the sky. The cabber at the front of the caravan stops, holds up a small wooden stick, a primitive precursor to the sextant, and aligns it with the pole star. He is not just checking north, he's measuring the angle to see how far we've traveled from the equator. You realize that your life is currently being managed by a man who treats the stars like a giant, glowing spreadsheet. He knows that if we drift even 5 degrees to the east, we all miss the next watering hole and become part of the fossil record. Salty lets out a low, vibrating hum. UV noticed that when he is tired, his breath smells less like desert and more like fermenting swamp. You pat his neck, and for a split second, he doesn't try to bite you. Species bonding that lasts until he steps on your heel. UV learned that the secret to walking in the Sahara at night isn't strength. It's the desert shuffle. You don't lift your feet, you slide them. It keeps the sand from filling your sandals and prevents you from tripping over the invisible ripples in the ground. The moon begins to rise, a giant, pale disk that turns the orange dunes into mountains of silver. The beauty is breathtaking, but the beauty is also a trap. Everything looks like a landmark. That ridge over there. Everything looks like a lake. The mirage of the moon is real. It's a psychological trick where your brain, starved of sensory input, starts to build a world that isn't. You have to keep your eyes on the stars and the heels of the man in front of you. Your legs turn into heavy, wooden pillars. Your indigo robe is now dusted with a fine layer of white, salt dust leaking from the slabs. Measured sip from your goatskin water bag. The water is cold, metallic, and tastes like the inside of a damp cave. But it's the most delicious thing you've ever tasted. You realize that out here, the definition of luxury has changed. It's not gold or silver. It's a mouthful of tepid water. And the fact that you are still moving forward, the silvery moonlight begins to stretch your shadow into a long, spindly giant that dances across the dunes. You've been walking for what feels like an eternity, and your sense of time has completely dissolved into the rhythmic crunch, swish of the sand. You notice that the veterans around you, in the deep desert night, conversation is a luxury that wastes moisture and breath. You find yourself entering a state of moving meditation, where the only things that exist are the stars above, and the swaying rear end of Salty, who seems to have finally accepted your presence as a permanent, albeit annoying. This brings us to a major mainstream historical fact. This brings us to a major maiden. During this period, the gold coming out of Mali was so abundant that it practically set the value of currencies across the Mediterranean and the Middle East. You are essentially walking on the 14th century version of an oil pipeline. If these caravans stopped, the mints in Florence, Venice, and Cairo would have run dry. You realize that your sore feet are currently supporting the weight of the global economy. which is a lot of pressure for someone who just wants a nap and a sandwich. But here, there's a quirky and somewhat bizarre detail about the salt you are carrying. It was just used for cooking. In the ancient Mali Empire, salt was often used as a building material for the wealthy. But more importantly, it was a vital part of the pharmacy. Because it was so pure, it was used to treat everything from toothaches to infected wounds. There are even accounts of travelers using large salt crystals as a primitive form of sunglasses or eye. Protection by peering through thin, translucent slivers to cut the desert glare. You reach back and touch one of the slabs on Salty. As back, it feels cold and clinical, like a block of ancient, petrified medicine. Interestingly, there is a bit of a scholarly debate regarding the desert ghosts, or the genies of the dunes, mentioned in almost every traveler's diary from this era. Many traders swore they heard voices, calling their names, or saw phantom cities in the distance at night. Academic circles are still debating whether these were purely psychological hallucinations caused by extreme sleep deprivation and sodium imbalance, or if they were a result of the singing sands phenomenon, where shifting dunes create low-frequency sounds that can actually induce a state of mild vertigo and auditory illusion. Whether it is physics or spirits, you find yourself pointedly not looking toward the dark gaps between the dunes. When you hear a sound like a distant drum, you notice the caber suddenly veers slightly to the right. Though to your eyes, the sand looks exactly the same as it did a mile ago. He's following the Tatten, the invisible path. He, thus looking for Liha, a specific type of ripple in the sand caused by the prevailing winds hitting a hidden underground rock formation. It's like reading a map written in Braille with your feet. You realize that if the Kabir were to vanish right now, the rest of you would be nothing more than a tragic archaeological find in 600 years. You stay close to Salty, who seems to have a sixth sense for the path, his large padded feet spreading out with every step to keep him from sinking. The cold is now so intense that your fingers have gone numb inside your sleeves. UV started to tuck your hands into the folds of your robe, letting the camel's heat radiate toward you when you walk close enough. You watch the stars shift, the three kings of Orion now, acting as a celestial clock in the Sahara. Don't you check the sky. You know that when Orion begins to dip toward the horizon, the caravan passes a marker. Not a signpost, but a pile of whitened bones. Some are camels, some are not. They serve as a grim reminder that the desert doesn't forgive mistakes. You find yourself whispering a small prayer of thanks to Salty for being so sturdy. UV notice that the camel handlers often sing low, droning songs to their animals. It's not just for entertainment. The rhythm of the song helps the camels maintain a steady pace, and the sound of a familiar voice keeps them from spooking in the dark, wet sigh that smells like fermented hay. Apparently, he is a critic. As the pre-dawn light begins to turn the sky from black to a deep, ghostly gray, You feel a second wind. The end of the night is in sight. Your legs are moving on their own now, a mechanical repetition that feels detached from your mind. You look at the horizon, waiting for that first sliver of fire that will turn this freezing silver world back into a golden furnace. UV survived another night under the Sahara stars, guided by ancient wisdom and the stubbornness of a beast that hates you. You take a deep, icy breath and prepare for the heat to return. The horizon is no longer a solid line. It's beginning to vibrate with the first hints of dawn, a thin ribbon of neon orange bleeding into the gray. This is the most dangerous time for your concentration. Your body is screaming for sleep, and the false dawn makes the dunes look like rolling waves of water. You find yourself blinking hard, trying to shake the image of a cold, bubbling spring out of your mind. Salty, sensing the change in light, has picked up his pace. Camels know the routine. Dawn means the sun is coming to bake them, and they are just as eager as you are to get under the shade of the heavy wool tents. This brings us to a major mainstream historical fact: the seasonal timing of these treks. Caravans didn't just wander out into the sand whenever they felt like it. The massive biannual expeditions, they timed their movements to coincide with the cooler winter months, or the tail end of the rainy season, when the underground aquifers were at their highest. Governed by the tilt of the earth and the moisture in the air. But here is a quirky and slightly gross detail about survival at the end of a long night. The camel has breath hygiene. UV noticed that your mouth feels like it's been lined with velvet and sand. In the desert, you can waste water on something as trivial as brushing your teeth. Instead, the traders use miswak, small twigs from the Salvadora persica tree. But when those run out, they have a much weirder trick. Some would use a tiny bit of the camel-sown saliva, which is surprisingly antiseptic, or even a specific type of bitter desert moss found near the salt pans. You watch a trader chew on a twig with a look of intense focus, and you decide that your velvet mouth isn't so bad after all. Interestingly, there's a bit of a scholarly debate regarding the ghost wells of the 14th century. Chroniclers often wrote about legendary watering holes that would appear for a few years and then vanish forever. Academic circles are still debating whether these were just exaggerations or a result of the paleo drainage systems, ancient underground riverbeds from a much greener Sahara that would occasionally burp up water after a rare, distant storm. Imagine the pressure on the Kabir. He has to decide whether to lead 5,000 people to a spot that might have been dry for a decade, based on a rumor he heard in a Timbuktu marketplace. You look at the Kabir now, and he looks as calm as a stone statue. He knows that in this landscape, a mistake it's a permanent erasure. Interestingly, there's a bit of a scholarly debate regarding the ghost wells of the 14th century. Chroniclers often wrote about legendary watering holes that would appear for a few years and then vanish forever. Academic circles are still debating whether these were just exaggerations or a result of the paleo drainage systems, ancient underground riverbeds from a much greener Sahara that would occasionally burp up water after a rare, distant storm. He has to decide whether to lead 5,000 people to a spot that might have been dry for a decade, based on a rumor he heard in a Timbuktu marketplace. You look at the back of his head and hope his memory is better than yours. The sun finally clears the horizon, and it doesn't rise so much as it attacks. Within minutes, the cool silver of the night is incinerated, replaced by a blinding white. Hot glare that makes your eyes throb. You pull your indigo veil, the lithium higher, until only a tiny slit remains. This veil is your most important tool. It creates a microclimate of moisture around your nose and mouth, trapping the humidity from your breath, so you don't dehydrate in the bone. Dry air. You realize that the mysterious look of the Tuareg and Mantuan traders wasn't a fashion choice. It was a biological shield. Salty stops abruptly, his front knees buckling as he begins the complicated process of sitting down. The rest of the caravan follows suit, a domino effect of groaning camels and shifting salt. The day camp is a masterpiece of efficiency. You and 3 others scramble to pull a heavy hair tarp over a set of collapsible wooden poles. This isn't a tent you can stand in. It's a low crawl space designed to keep the sun off your body and the wind from stealing your sweat. You crawl inside, feeling the temperature drop by 20 degrees instantly. You sit cross-legged on a rough mat, leaning your back against one of the salt slabs. It's still radiating the cold of the night, a giant, rectangular ice pack that will slowly warm up as the day progresses. One of the handlers passes around a bowl of lukewarm mixture of pounded millet, goat milk, and honey. It's gritty and sweet, and you eat it with your fingers, savoring the calories. You notice that even in this state of exhaustion, no one wastes a single drop. If you spill, you essentially throwing away minutes of your life. As you lie down to sleep, the sound of the desert begins to change. The rhythmic walking is replaced by the whipping sound of sand hitting the outside of the tent. A morning breeze is picked up, and even a light wind can move a terrifying amount of dust. You close your eyes, but your ears are still tuned to the sounds of the camp. You hear the camels chewing their cud, a wet, grinding sound that is strangely comforting. It means they are healthy. If a camel stops chewing, the caravan stops moving, and no one wants to stop moving. In the middle of the Tatan, you find yourself thinking about the value of the salt you are using as a pillow. In Europe, it's the skeleton of an empire. You've heard stories that in the deepest parts of the rainforest to the south, stuff that they will trade a handful of gold dust for a piece of salt the size of a pigeon. It is a strange world where something you can dig out of the ground in one place is more precious than the metal kings kill for in another. The heat outside the tent is now a physical weight, pressing down on the wool fabric. You can feel the moisture being sucked out of the air, out of the leather water skins, and out of your very skin. You drift into a shallow, feverish sleep, dreaming of rain and the sound of the Niger River. And as you lose consciousness, you realize that the hardest part isn't the walking. It is the waiting for the sun to go away. You wake up to the sound of a leather whip snapping against the air, not to strike a beast, but to signal that the sun has finally lost its bite. The sky is a pale, washed in out yellow, and the shadows are beginning to stretch their long purple fingers across the dunes again. You crawl out from under the camel gin hair tarp, and for a second, the dry air makes your lungs feel like they're being lightly toasted. Your skin feels tight, coated in a fine crystalline layer of salt and dust that has turned your indigo robe into a stiff, looking at the horizon with that same expression of deep, cosmic resentment. This brings us to a crucial mainstream historical fact: the Sanzian reading expertise of the 16th century cavers. We often talk about the stars in a landscape where a sandstorm can erase a Wusher 10-foot dune overnight. The Soundal navigators relied on the memory of the sand, rusty reds of the central plains. He also looked for raggies of black gravel that served us between the shifting sand seas. Rains of the desert. But here's a quirky and slightly unsettling little detail about these desert highways. Because the wind is constantly shifting the sand, physical markers are rare. However, the path of the Tagaza was often lined with the sun's animals. Some chroniclers mentioned that in certain narrow passes, the pavement was literally made of bone. Experienced traders could identify their progress by the specific arrangement of a camel's rib cage or a donkey's skull that had been stuck in the same spot for 50 years. It's a macabre version of a roadside attraction, where the history of the trail is written in the debris of those who didn't finish it. Interestingly, there's a bit of a scholarly debate regarding the scent of the Sahara. Academic circles are still debating the extent to which ancient navigators used their sense of smell to find water. Some historical accounts claim that a master cabber could smell a hidden oasis from over 30 miles away, catching the faint scent of damp earth and palm leaves on the wind long before the eyes could see a single green leaf. Critics argue this is mere legend, while others suggest that in an environment with zero competing smells, the human nose becomes hypersensitized to moisture. You try to sniff the air, but all you can smell is salty's distinctive essence and the dry, metallic tang of the salt blocks. You begin the process of reloading the camels. This is the most dangerous part of the day. A camel that isn't balanced correctly will tire out within hours, and a tired camel is a dead camel. You lift a slab of rock salt. It's about the size of a large suitcase and surprisingly heavy, roughly Lil-Shudabashabam. You slide it into the leather sling on Salty's side, feeling the rough, crystalline surface grate against your palms. This salt was carved from the earth into Gaza, and you can still see the chisel marks. It's a humble Zan-looking thing. Yet you know that in a few weeks, people will be willing to fight and die for a piece of it. As the caravan begins to move, you notice the rhythm has changed. Everyone is more alert. You're entering the empty quarter, a most desolate stretch of the journey where the wells are furthest apart. He's checking the wind. If the wind starts to whistle through the dunes in a certain way, it means a haboob, a massive sandstorm, is brewing. In the 16th century, a sandstorm didn't just slow you down. It could bury 1,000 Zan, turning a thriving trade mission into a permanent monument of sand. You reach for your water skin, but you stop yourself. You've learned the 3 Zan sip rule: 1 to wet the lips, 1 to swirl in the mouth, and 1 to swallow. Anything more is greed. They seem almost like statues made of indigo and dust, moving with a terrifying efficiency. They don't waste a single movement. They don't swat at the occasional desert fly, or adjust their robes unnecessarily. They have become part of the desert's own stillness. And you feel that familiar chill returning. It's almost a relief after the suffocating heat of the tent. You look at the North Star and feel a strange sense of kinship with it. It's your only constant in a world that is literally shifting beneath your feet. You settle into the shuffle, the sand sliding into your sandals, the salt slabs creaking, and the desert opening its vast, dark arms to welcome you back for another night of survival. You are no longer a stranger here. You are a pilgrim of the salt. The night air is crisp, almost sharp, as it fills your lungs. You've noticed that the sand in this part of the desert has changed texture. It's no longer the fine, powdery dust of the Sahel, but a coarser, grittier grain that sounds like breaking glass under your sandals. You pass a reg, a vast, flat plain of black pebbles that reflects the starlight like a dark, frozen sea. These plains are a blessing for your tired legs, providing a firm surface after hours of trudging through soft dunes. But the silence here is even deeper. On the dunes, a wind sings. On the gravel plains, the actual transaction that happens at the end of your journey is often conducted in total silence. According to famous accounts of gold dust next to the salt and withdrawal. If the salt traders were satisfied with the amount of gold, they took it and left. If not, they waited. They never spoke a word to each other. But here is a quirky and slightly gross detail about your currency. Rock salt is incredibly hygroscopic, meaning it absorbs moisture from the air. In the humid southern regions of the Mali Empire, those massive slabs you were carrying would actually start to sweat and slowly dissolve if they weren't used quickly. This created a frantic, use it or lose it economy to prevent their wealth from literally melting away. Elevated dry rooms or wrapped in multiple layers of treated animal hide. You realize that your wealth is essentially an evaporating asset. The longer it takes you to get to the market, the smaller your coins become. There's a bit of a scholarly debate regarding the scurvy mystery of the Sahara. In many ancient maritime voyages, sailors died of scurvy due to a lack of vitamin C. However, Saharan traders, who spent months without fresh fruit or vegetables, rarely seem to suffer from it. Some researchers suggest that the fermented milk products and dried dates you've been eating provided just enough nutrients, while others argue that the specific minerals found in the desert well water might have acted as a primitive multivitamin. Whatever the reason, you're glad your teeth aren't falling out yet, though your gums do feel a bit tender from all the sand you accidentally chewed. For some reason, is in a particularly foul mood tonight. He keeps trying to sidestep the path, forced back into line only by the sharp, rhythmic clicking sounds made by the handler behind you. You realize that Salty can smell things you can see. To you, he might be smelling a distant, drying carcass, or perhaps the faint, metallic scent of assault pans, still many miles away. UV learned to trust his ears. If they are pinned back, he's annoyed. But if they are twitching forward, he's alert to something in the dark. You look over at the merchant walking next to you. His face is almost entirely hidden by his indigo veil, but you can see the deep wrinkles around his eyes, stained blue by the dye. He's carrying a small leather pouch around his neck, a gris. Inside are verses from the Quran or ancient symbols meant to ward off the evil eye. And the desert spirits. In the 14th century, the Sahara was a place where Islamic scholarship and indigenous African mysticism blended perfectly. You don't have an amulet, so you just keep your hand on salty lead rope and hope the stars are enough to protect you. The night march continues, and you find yourself counting your steps to stay awake. A very large bucket of fresh, cold water. You realize that out here, gold feels abstract, almost imaginary. Salt and water are the only things that feel real. You touch the cold, hard surface of the slab on salty, spacked, reminding yourself that this dirty ice is your ticket back to civilization. As the constellation of the Scorpion begins to rise in the south, the caber raises his staff. It's not time for a full stop, but a brief moment to adjust the loads. You lean your forehead against salty, warm, fuzzy neck for a second. He smells of old campfire and stubbornness. You realize that you've stopped being a city person, visiting the desert. The dust is in your lungs, the salt is in your pores, and the rhythm of the caravan is now the rhythm of your own heart. You are a part of the Sahara now, and the desert is slowly, quietly. The gravel plains finally give way back to the dunes. But these are different. They are the great longitudinal dunes, massive ridges of sand that run for miles like the petrified waves of a prehistoric ocean. To cross them, that would exhaust the camels and break your spirit. Instead, you move through the natural corridors between the ridges. The walls of sand rise 100 feet on either side of you, blocking out the wind but trapping the silence. You can hear every shifting grain of sand, every creak of the camel saddles, and the heavy, synchronized thud of 1,000 padded feet. This leads us to a fascinating mainstream historical fact: the camel and saddle revolution. You might notice that the saddle Salty is wearing isn't just a pile of blankets. It's a sophisticated piece of engineering known as the North African or Rahala saddle. Unlike earlier designs that sat on the camel's neck, this frame sits right over the hump, distributing the weight of the heavy salt slabs across the animal's rib cage. This invention, the CNTH, allowed camels to carry nearly double the weight for longer distances. The Mali Empire would have been half as wealthy and twice as hungry. But here's a quirky and slightly morbid bit of desert lore. The Salt and Lick Compass. Unremarkable patch of sand. The camels weren't crazy. They were smelling salt in earth. In certain parts of the Sahara, the groundwater is so minerals and heavy that it leaves a crust just beneath the surface. If the camels started licking the ground, it meant you were near an ancient, dried sand-up lake bed, which usually meant a well was nearby, hidden under the shifting drifts. You watch Salty sniff the ground, hoping he's feeling particularly salty tonight. Interestingly, there's a bit of a scholarly debate. Regarding the taxes of the trail, we often think of the desert as a lawless void, but academic circles are still debating the complex system of protection fees paid by these caravans. The Mali Empire didn't just claim the desert, they managed it. You are likely traveling with a passport, a specific token, or a written scroll from the Mansa's court. Historians argue over whether the nomadic Tuareg tribes who guarded these routes were independent raiders or essentially the contractors of the Malian state. You see a group of veiled riders on the horizon, their spears glinting in the starlight. They don't attack, they just watch. You realize that your safety isn't a right. It's a paid zan for service. Your sandals are starting to fail. The leather straps are fraying from the constant friction of the sand, which acts like industrial gen-grade sandpaper. You watch the man in front of you pull out a needle made of bone. He doesn't even stop walking. He mends his footwear with practiced, mechanical movements. This is the reality of the Tagaza. There are no breaks for maintenance. You learn to fix your life while you're still moving through it. The caber stops and points toward a star that seems to be sitting right on the tip of a distant dune. It's not a star. It's a campfire. Your heart leaps. A campfire means other humans, and more importantly, it means you've reached the halfway well. But you don't run. In the desert, approaching a camp too fast is a good way to get a spear in the chest. And the handlers begin to chant a specific melody, a caravan song that identifies you as friends, not raiders. As you draw closer, the smell of the fire hits you. It's not the refined smell of wood. It's the pungent, earthy smoke of burning camel dung, the only fuel available for hundreds of miles. To anyone else, it would be foul. But to you, it smells like a 5-star hotel. You've made it through the most dangerous stretch of the empty quarter. You lead Salty toward the communal tethering area. Your legs feel like they've been replaced with lead pipes, and your back is a map of aches. But as you watch the first bucket of water being pulled from the deep, dark throat of the well, you feel a surge of pure, primal joy. The water is brown, gritty, and probably full of things that would make a modern doctor faint. But as you wait your turn, you realize you've never seen anything so beautiful. You survive another night, not because you are strong, but because you and Salty have become a single, stubborn unit of survival. The camp at the halfway well is less of a resting place and more of a gritty, desperate survival hub. The air is thick with the scent of wet sand, unwashed wool, and that pungent dung smoke that has become the soundtrack to your olfactory life. You are currently witnessing one of the most brutal realities of the salt trade. The thirst test. Before you are allowed to drink, the camels must be watered. It's a chaotic scene of massive animals pushing and shoving, their long necks weaving like snakes as they wait for the leather buckets to rise from the yowling means in foot's in deep shaft. You watch a handler pour a bucket into a stone trough, and the sound of the camels slurping is so loud it drowns out the wind. This leads us to a fascinating mainstream historical fact: the hidden hydrology of the Sahara. You might wonder how a well stays wet in the middle of a sea of sand. The Mali Empire's trade routes were built on top of aquifers, massive underground stone basins that trapped water from thousands of years ago when the Sahara was actually a lush savanna with hippos and rivers. When you drink from this, well, you are literally drinking prehistoric rain that fell before the pyramids were even built. The Kabir knows exactly how much can be drawn before the well. A primitive but effective form of sustainable water management that kept these routes open for centuries. But here's a quirky and slightly stomach-gin turning detail about your hydration. The water, gin skin biofilm. Your water is stored in gerbas, goat skins that have been tanned with acacia bark and rubbed with animal fat. Over weeks in the heat, the inside of the skin develops a slimy, living lining. While it sounds disgusting, veteran traders actually prefer it. They believe the slime seals the pores of the leather, preventing evaporation. You take a sip, and the water is thick, tasting of goat, tree bark, and ancient history. It's an acquired taste, but when the alternative is mummification, it's basically nectar. While we focus on salt and gold, academic circles are still debating the volume of other invisible goods moving on these camels. Some historians argue that the caravans were the primary way for books and manuscripts to travel between the universities of Timbuktu. You might be leaning against a salt slab, but the camel next to you could be carrying the only copy of a Greek philosophical treatise, translated into Arabic. The Sahara wasn't just a barrier. It was a high-gen-speed data cable for the Shusaite century, transmitting ideas as much as minerals. As you sit by the dying embers of a fire, a traveler from a northbound caravan sits across from you. He's heading toward the salt mines of Tagaza while you're heading south toward the Niger. You don't share a language, but you share a gesture. He offers you a piece of kabula, pounded meat mixed with fat and berries. It's the original energy bar. You give him a small pinch of loose salt you found in the bottom of a sling. There might be no one to help you when your water skin leaks tomorrow. You look at your hands. They are stained a permanent, ghostly blue from your indigo robe, and the skin is cracked like the desert floor. You've lost weight, your cheekbones are sharp, and your eyes have developed a permanent squint from the glare. You realize you don't look like a city dweller anymore. You look like the desert. You feel a strange sense of pride in that. You've crossed the zone of fear, and while you're only halfway to the gold markets, you've proven that you can endure the silence. The Kabir walks through the camp, tapping his staff on the ground. The rest is over. The Zifeng, monsoon, winds of the upper atmosphere are shifting, and he wants to move before the dust starts to swirl. You stand up, and your joints creak in a perfect imitation of the camel saddles. You find Salty, who is looking remarkably refreshed after drinking about 30 gallons of prehistoric rain. He nudges you, almost gently this time, as if to say, "Get moving, human. The stars aren't going to follow themselves." As you pull the lead rope and the caravan snouts back into the darkness, you look at the well one last time, but it's the only reason you're alive. The moon is setting, and the horizon ahead is a wall of obsidian. You step back into the rhythm, the crunched and swish of the sand returning to fill your ears. The southern forests are still far away. But for the first time, you can almost smell the humidity of the river as you move south from the halfway point. The desert begins to change its personality. The dunes are becoming shorter, more fragmented, and you start to see the first signs of life that aren't the scorpions or sun. Its roots reaching deep into the hidden veins of the earth. It looks like a skeletal hand reaching out of the sand, but to you, it's the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. It means the deep waste is behind you. However, this is also where the gold fever begins to infect the caravan the closer you get to the markets of the Mali Empire. The more the air feels electric with the promise of wealth. This brings us to a major mainstream historical fact. The legendary wealth of Mansa Musa. Around this time in the 14th century, the king of Mali made his famous pilgrimage to Mecca, carrying so much gold that he caused a decade-long inflation crisis in Egypt just by spending it. But the source of that gold, the mines of Bambuk and Bure, was a closely guarded state secret. You are part of the only machine allowed to unlock that gold. Without your salt, the miners in the south wouldn't trade a single grain of gold dust. You are the key to the richest treasury on the planet. And you carrying that key on the back of a camel that currently has a very itchy left ear. But here is a quirky and slightly hilarious detail about medieval economics. The currency of the jungle. In the southern regions approaching, gold was so common that it wasn't always the most prestigious thing to own. Aside from salt, the other major currency was the cowrie shell. These tiny shells were brought all the way from the Indian Ocean, through Cairo, and across the desert. You might see a merchant who owns 10 pounds of gold, but will still haggle for hours over a handful of shells. It's a reminder that value is entirely subjective. Out here, a rock you can eat, salt, and a shell from a distant sea are often more useful than the yellow metal that makes the rest of the world go crazy. Interestingly, there's a bit of a scholarly debate regarding the great inflation caused by your very caravan. Academic circles are still debating whether the influx of salt actually helped stabilize the Malian economy, or if it created a resource curse. Some historians argue that the sheer volume of salt arriving at the Niger River caused the price of gold to plummet locally, making basic goods like grain and cloth incredibly expensive for the average citizen. You are essentially a walking economic stimulus package. But you are also a potential inflation bomb. You look at Salty and realize he's carrying enough monetary value to accidentally ruin a small city. But at the behavior of birds, he points to a speck in the sky. It's a sign that water is near, not in a deep hidden well, but in open pools. The desert shuffle is replaced by a more confident stride. Even the camels seem to hold their heads higher, their nostrils flaring as they catch the scent of damp earth and rotting vegetation, the perfume of the Sahel. One night, as you sit by the fire, the K-bird tells a story about the copper mines of Tegeta. He explains that while salt is the king of the north, copper is the queen of the east. The Mali Empire was a crossroads of 3 different valuable rocks: salt from the north, gold from the south, and copper from the east. You realize that you aren't just in a desert. You are in the middle of a massive continental scale jigsaw puzzle where every piece is a mineral. The Sahara isn't an empty space. It's a busy warehouse where the gods are constantly moving inventory. Suddenly, you see it. On the horizon, a dark, shimmering line that isn't a mirage. It's the Niger River. The sight of that much water, moving and living, is almost overwhelming. UV spent weeks in a world where water was a precious, hidden liquid measured in sips. Now, the salt on salty speck seems to glow in the twilight, as if it knows its long journey is almost over. You feel a lump in your throat. UV crossed the most unforgiving landscape on Earth, guided by stars and the wisdom of men who can smell the difference between two types of sand. As the caravan descends toward the riverbanks, you pass through the first permanent villages. People come out to watch you pass. They aren't looking at you. They are looking at the salt. To them, you are a ghost from the north, bringing the gift of life. You pull Salty's rope. But it was simple here. In the world of men and rivers, things are complicated. But as you smell the first whiff of tropical rain on the wind, you realize that UV done it. UV survived the Sahara, and you're about to become very. The air is no longer a dry, searing blade. It's heavy and thick, clinging to your skin like a damp blanket. UV reached the riverbanks of the Niger, where the world is suddenly, shockingly green. The transition is jarring. After weeks of monochrome orange and silver, the vibrant emerald of the river reads in the deep brown of the mud. Brick architecture of Timbuktu feel like a sensory overload. You lead Salty through the bustling gates of the city and the sounds of the Sahara. The wind, the silence, the rhythmic crunch are replaced by the chaotic symphony of a global metropolis. You hear a dozen different languages, the clatter of iron working, and the distant call to prayer from the great Sankor Mosque. It was one of the intellectual capitals of the world. While you were worried about surviving the night, scholars just a few blocks away were debating astronomy. The wealth generated by your salt slabs funded one of the greatest concentrations of libraries and universities in human history. You aren't just a delivery person. You are the financier of an African renaissance. The salt you carried on your back is the very foundation upon which these houses of wisdom were built. But here, as a quirky and slightly ironic detail about the end of your journey, a salt-weight paradox. After traveling nearly 500 miles to protect every ounce of that salt, the final transaction is often the most casual part of the trip. You watch the master merchants rectangular slabs into smaller chunks using simple iron picks. It feels almost criminal to see those perfect blocks shattered, but in the markets of the South, small change is literally a handful of salt crystals. You might use a piece of your cargo to buy a bowl of spicy fish stew or a new pair of leather sandals, effectively eating and wearing your own profit. Interestingly, there is a bit of a scholarly debate regarding the exact location of the gold mines you've been aiming for. For centuries, the miners of the Wangara regions kept the locations of their gold fields so secret that even the Mansa of Mali didn't know exactly where they were. Academic circles are still debating whether the silent trade we mentioned earlier was a way for the miners to protect themselves from being enslaved or simply a brilliant marketing tactic. Keep the price of gold high by maintaining its mystery. You stand on the riverbank, looking south, realizing that even though you've crossed a desert, the true heart of the empire remains hidden behind a curtain of jungle and secrecy. You finally unbuckle the leather straps from Salty. He lets out a massive, vibrating groan and immediately heads for the river to drink his fill. You watch the laborers carry your salt into the royal storehouses, where it is weighed against tiny, ornate bronze weights. When the scales balance, you are handed a small leather pouch. It's surprisingly heavy. You open it to find it filled with tibi, fine shimmering gold dust. It's the color of the sun you spent the last 40 days hiding from. You realize that you've traded a month of your life, several layers of skin, and a significant amount of your sanity for a handful of yellow dirt. And yet, looking at it, you know you do it all over again. The journey has changed you. You find yourself walking with a desert tilt, your eyes still scanning the horizon for dunes that aren't there. You find the soft beds of the city too quiet. You miss the grumpy breathing of the camels and the cold, indifferent guidance of the North Star. You sit at a riverside tavern, watching the sunset reflect off the Niger. The water is gold, the sky is salt. You don't have to worry about where your next sip is coming from. You've bridged the gap between the waste and the wealth, and you have the blue, stained hands to prove it. The salt has been sold, the gold is safe in your pouch, and the desert winds are now just a distant, gentle hum. Perhaps it is the sound of the fan in your room, or just the rhythm of your own breathing. You are no longer on the shifting sands. You are safe, you are warm, and the ground beneath you is solid and still. Imagine the coolness of the Niger River air drifting through your window, carrying away the last of the desert as heat. Your muscles, which have been tense for 1,000 miles, are finally letting go, sinking deeper into the soft, welcoming embrace of sleep. The stars are still there, watching over you, but they aren't your navigators anymore. They read just nightlights for your dreams. The Sahara is a vast, quiet memory now, a golden ocean that has carried you home to the shore of sleep. Close your eyes. The camels are resting. The fires have burned down to soft. You've done the hard work.